This is Monday, May 20th from Epsom, New Hampshire. This is wildlife biologist Eric Orff. I'm going to talk about some things in my diary. I've started working for New Hampshire Fish and Game in 1976, and shortly thereafter, by January '77, I was keeping a diary, which I've kept every day since. So I have 40 something diaries here. And as a wildlife biologist for New Hampshire Fish and Game, I have luckily recorded many of the things that I encountered and did over my 31-year career at New Hampshire Fish and Game, and I retired in 2005, or 7 rather. And so I like to crack open a diary now and then and see what went on some years ago, and kind of bring back to life some of those events. So many people I know and have spoken to over the years said, "Oh, I wanted to be a wildlife biologist, but I got sidetracked." So, I've always tried to be a good communicator and let people know what was going on. I've been blogging for over 15 years at New Hampshire FishandWildlife.com. I've been an active writer for over 40 years and have produced hundreds, if not thousands, of articles. And so I'm digging back in my diary back to 1983, which was a very memorable, actually about a 20-day period where I was involved in removing deer from an island in Lake Winnipesaukee. Lake Winnipesaukee is 72 square miles, about 21 miles long. It's our largest lake in New Hampshire. And I was called to help my supervisor, Henry Laramie, remove some deer from the island. So here are some notes that I kind of transcribed after that experience, and thought I'd read some of them and delve into what happened during some of that time. So it said, in my nearly 30 years of experience as a wildlife biologist for New Hampshire Fish and Game, I've had many wonderful experiences dealing with all sorts of wildlife. And then also, since 1983, I own and operated a part-time nuisance wildlife control business that provided another whole spectrum of experiences. Certainly hundreds, if not thousands of more experiences have brought me to up close and personal with bear, moose, deer, bats, snakes, bobcats, and more. I've literally had experiences with animals from mice to moose. Fortunately, all that time I've kept my daily diaries. I've recorded much of those experiences in detail. Some experiences stand out far and above most others, and for a couple of cold November weeks in 1983 is one of those experiences. You see, I was picked by my supervisor, Henry Laramie, to help capture and remove live deer from Long Island in Lake Winnipesaukee, New Hampshire. So, as I said, Long Island actually is about 1.5 miles long by a half mile wide. So Long Island has a bridge to the mainland on Molten Borough Neck, and for many years it has held the densest deer population in the state. In fact, surveys done twice have counted over 100 deer, and now 100 deer in a little, mile or mile and a half, square mile. In the rest of the state at that time, and even today, the average deer population in New Hampshire is something like 5 to 10 deer per square mile. So here is 10 times that number of deer, and basically they have really impacted the vegetation severely. For many years in the 60s, there was a deer hunt on Long Island to reduce the deer numbers by disabled veterans, paraplegics, and I had a friend that regularly did that. The hunt stopped in the early 70s, and that's why the deer population had grown so significantly. And although some deer do go to and from the mainland, most of them stay there much of the time. So I hurriedly got my stuff together and began collecting equipment needed to tranquilize deer. I did have 3 or 4 years tranquilizing nuisance bear with Henry, so I had a leg up on most of the other biologists. I think that's why I was selected. I became the New Hampshire Fish and Game's first black bear biologist in October of 1978, and had worked with bears for a number of years. So my diary says on Monday, November 7th, 1983, was a clear, nice day. I finished collecting the supplies at Fish and Game headquarters in the morning and headed up to Long Island by 1 p.m. We set up a corral trap, which was made up of huge nets we'd borrowed from the fisheries division, and a kind of a big corral with a drop gate that we could actually activate by pulling a long rope. And we had eight box traps. We borrowed these, I think, from Vermont. I can't at the time. They're basically big have-a-heart traps for deer. They were, I would say about 7 or 8 feet long by 5 feet high by 4 or 5 feet wide, made out of aluminum tubing, as I recall, with netting sewn to the side. So it was just a big box with a gate that could be triggered by a mechanism within the trap when a deer went in to grab. In our case, we were feeding them apples. There were too many malnourished deer on the island, and therefore they were in very poor condition. And my notes here say at least a quarter of the 27 deer we captured died before they could be released. Even though the ones we caught in the nets were quickly put into transportation crates, and we didn't tranquilize those to reduce stress, and then we shipped them within hours. So even then, some of them died. So I note that on November 8th, it was a Tuesday, it was clear and cold, so this is November, the deer started moving around 3 p.m. that day. Henry had caught a doe, a female deer, in a drop net, and we missed one in the corral when it bolted just as the gate fell. Later, we captured another doe in the corral. The fishing game director, Charlie Berry, stopped by that evening with a couple of conservation officers, including trainee Tim Macerno and Dave Hewitt, and I will speak of him again a little bit. Well, right now, Dave was a big help. He was patrolling that area, and night after night when we were working, Dave would get there in the evening, and basically I sat in the back seat of his cruiser with my tranquilizer gun and shot deer with a tranquilizer dart out of the back of his vehicle. So Dave Hewitt and I were deer poaching for a couple of weeks. good duty. So we did manage to catch a couple more deer with traps over the next couple of days. And in fact, what I'd decided to do is I went back down to headquarters and I got a couple of my bear collars. Now, a bear collar, of course, you don't want it running when it comes from the factory until you use it. So it actually has a magnet taped onto the collar in this particular spot, and that keeps it from working, from using up the battery. So what I did with with this collar was I rigged it to one of the traps, one of the clover traps, so when the gate went down, it would send a signal to the RV that Henry and I had camped out in for the duration, the 20-day duration of this capture effort. So I mentioned that we brought the trailer up. A couple of times the receiver started pinging at 3 or 4 a.m. I note here, and I darted out of the trailer to find a raccoon in one particular clover trap. Friday, November 11th, is one of those days that stand out in my mind. Not for what I caught, but for what we didn't. Henry had left me alone to get more supplies around 1 p.m. Tim Macerno helped me move a couple of clover traps, and he left two around 2 p.m. By now, the deer seemed to have learned about our traps. We're steering clear of them. I laid down early that night and was awakened around 9 p.m. by my radio pinging. It was the raccoon trap. So I headed out alone, expecting to release yet another raccoon. Not a huge buck, a 10-point buck by my count, up close count, was flailing away in the trap. Boy, was he unhappy to see me. He was lifting the trap off the ground, throwing his head and lifting the trap off the ground. I tried to hold it down. We had staked it with rope and stakes, but he had pulled those all out, so the trap was literally jumping in the air. So I tried to hold it down, and I was fumbling in trying to get a tranquilizer out of my pocket. How I expected to do that, I don't know, but I just remember trying to get a needle and tranquilizer out of my pocket with one hand and holding the trap with the other hand. And but he was getting more stirred up by the second. In fact, he and I were in a standoff for a brief moment. Then he just simply put his head down and he ripped into the cage, the side of it, and dripped it and disappeared into the blackness of the night. I knew there were some big bucks around, as a few nights before we had been using one of the conservation officers' Vietnam-era night scope, a long scope. And I'd watched, not far away, a 10 and a 12-point buck duke it out in the field. In fact, when I was watching these traps before I rigged them with the magnets on the collars, I had watched several of the traps through that night scope and watched other bucks fight. So November 15th, let's see, rain to snow at night. So we began shooting some deer with the tranquilizer darts. Now we didn't have the radios for the darts yet, so it was just a dart about that long, metal aluminum dart, and we would shoot the deer and try to watch them, because it takes 5, 10, even 15 minutes for a deer actually to go down. And the drug we're using is still being used today. It's the best that we have. Even though the deers go down, they are very sensitive to light and especially to sound. So you just can't make any sound as you approach these deer that are laying down, or they just simply get up and run away and lay down someplace else. So I had started checking the traps at 6 a.m. and I worked well in the night. So my diary said I worked 22.5 hours straight, and I loved every minute of it, it says. I remember one night when we shot a deer, and it went down. When I had a habit of, I'd learned that when I got a habit of get near the deer, so basically when the deer went kind of in a direction and looked like they might be going down, I would turn my light off and just creep very quietly through the woods until I could actually feel the deer in the total darkness. And then I would throw a rope around its neck and tie it off to a tree so they couldn't get away. And then I would hog tie it and then turn my light on to signal the rest of the crew to if they're around, to come help me lug it out. So it says here, when I got close, I would crawl on my hands and knees and in the darkness, so I would avoid sticks and to make any sharp noises. Time after time, I put my hands on deer in total darkness. I learned rather quickly to first get a rope around the deer's neck and tie it to a tree so it couldn't escape. I remember one night putting a rope around the neck. Just then, and before I could tie it to a tree, it ran off with my rope. How I listened as the deer dashed off into the night. I spent the better part of the next hour in a cold, cloudy, moonless night, quietly crawling and feeling the forest floors until I found the 1/4-inch rope. So here's what I had to find in the middle of the woods, in the middle of the night, without a light. And sure enough, I did get that deer and was able to remove it. So basically, I said those were adrenaline-filled nights. I had an awesome time, and I've got a few more nights here that I'm going to cover in another video. More stories to come from the diaries of veteran wildlife biologist Eric Orff. Stay tuned.